For under $1,000 the Canon R50 is pretty much the best bang for the buck camera you can get for any type of photos, content creation, and video. And if you've been around my channel for a while, you know I've been recommending this camera for well over a year now, and I've made a ton of videos about this camera, from reviews to tutorials, as well as lens recommendations and things like that, and I'm going to go ahead and link all those videos down in the description if you want to learn more about this. But in today's video I'm going to talk about 7 things you can do to maximize the video quality out of your Canon R50. And so you can either pick and choose one or a couple of these to try out, or you can use all 7 of these to really squeeze out the most video quality you can out of this camera. And like always, I'm not going to waste your time. I'm going to jump right into this video, but if it does help you out, please consider dropping a like and subscribing to my channel. Alright, first up, if you want to get the sharpest possible video out of the Canon R50, you're going to want to record in a 4K video mode. And so in this camera, there's 2 different 4K frame rates you can record in, either 24 frames per second in 4K or 30 frames per second in 4K. 24 frames per second just looks a little bit more cinematic if that's the look you're going for, and 30 frames per second is just a little bit more smooth and more natural. The common way to notice this difference is 24 frames per second is what movies are filmed in. They just look a little bit more cinematic. It's really hard to explain. It's just something that your mind kind of notices. And then if you watch something like television or a sitcom, it doesn't look as cinematic, but it looks more smooth and I guess realistic is what I'm going for. And now I don't want to act like there's this huge, massive night and day difference between 24 and 30 frames per second, but in general, 24 frames per second is just a little bit more of a cinematic frame per second to shoot in, and 30 frames per second is going to give you a little bit smoother, more natural looking video. And so I'd recommend picking one of those 2. And the best part about the 4K, specifically from the Canon R50, is it's actually downsampled from 6K. And so this camera will originally record a 6K video, and then in the camera it'll kind of downscale it to a 4K video file, and then that's what you're getting, of course, out of this camera. And now I don't want to go too deep into this, but basically the 4K video you get out of the Canon R50 is really, really sharp. It's sharper than just standard 4K, and that's why I would recommend always recording in 4K. However, there is one circumstance where you'd want to record in less than 4K, and that's if you want to record anything in slow motion. So if you want to get those smooth slow motion videos, you're going to have to go down to 1080p, but you can actually do 1080p at 120 frames per second, which while it isn't quite as sharp as the 4K, it's going to give you that really slow motion smooth video that is also going to look really good and really cinematic. You're just going to lose a little bit of sharpness and you're going to add a little bit more noise and grain into the video, but it still does look really good and you're getting that nice smooth slow motion video. But in any other circumstance, when you just want to record regular motion video, I would always use the 4K in this camera. Alright, next up, kind of going off of that, you're going to always want to use the 180-degree shutter rule as well. And basically this kind of goes back to movies as well. This is kind of just always how it's been done. But essentially what you want to do is when you record any type of video, you want to set your shutter speed to be double what your frame rate is. So for example, if you're recording 4K at 24 frames per second, your shutter speed should be 1/50th, which isn't quite exactly double, but it's as close to double as you can get with this camera. And same goes for if you want to record in 60 frames per second, you're going to want to bump that shutter speed up to 1/125th. Like I said, not exactly double, but 1/125th is the closest you can get to double that 60 frame per second. And so this is something that doesn't matter what camera or what frame per second it is, just always try to have your shutter speed double what your frame rate is to get the most natural motion blur and most natural looking videos. Alright, next up, this one actually isn't a setting. This is going to be this little guy right here. Real quick, I just released my brand new Lightroom preset pack that you can pick up right now for only $5. It comes with 5 presets that I custom made to work with any style of photo you want to take, and of course they're going to work with any photo from any camera and any lens. So with literally one click, these are going to completely transform your photos and save you a ton of time photo editing. And like I said, they're only $5, so go check those out down in the description. Now let's get back to the video. And so this right here is a mist filter. Now if you don't know what this is, it's essentially a threaded filter that threads right into the front of your lens. You can get these in pretty much any size to fit any type of lens you have. Like I said, it's called a mist filter most of the times. It kind of can be called a bunch of different names, but this is the Tiffin Black Pro Mist. And so essentially these mist filters have this really fine mist over top of this filter. And what it kind of does is it adds this like diffusion, this mist, this softness to your images or videos. And it's really, really subtle. I don't know if you'll be able to tell if I do this right here, but it just softens up the highlights a little bit. It kind of softens the whole image just slightly. It adds some imperfections. It kind of flares the highlights and makes the highlights look a little bit less harsh. It slightly raises the shadows as well. And like I said, it's a very slight difference. Now there is different strengths that you can get for these as well. The one I have here is a Black Pro Mist quarter. And so you can get these in a 1/8, 1/4, 1/2, 1, and maybe even a 2. A quarter is probably what I would recommend. It's pretty subtle if you don't want any extreme flaring and extreme, imperfections in your video, but it really just smooths your whole image out a little bit. It gets rid of a little contrast. Like I said, it makes the highlights look a little bit less harsh. Again, just like everything I've recommended so far, these are just really small changes that when you add them up, it's really just gonna add up to give you that more professional, better looking video. Alright, next up, if you don't already have one, I would recommend picking up a fast aperture lens like the Canon RF 24, 35, or 50mm f1.8. So for example, I have the 50mm f1.8 on my R50 right here. And so what having, wide aperture like f1.8, 1.4, or f2 or something like that gonna do is just give you a really shallow depth of field. It's gonna help separate your subject or your foreground from your background. And generally, not all the time, but generally this is gonna give you just a little bit more professional, just a little bit better looking video than something like a kit lens would that's gonna have a slower aperture like f4.5, f5.6, f6.3 that won't allow you to really separate your subject from the background and foreground, which sometimes you're gonna wanna do to just get that more professional, more crisp, more punchy looking video. A fast aperture lens is always gonna help you do that, help you get a little bit punchier videos. And what these will also help you do is get better quality video in low light. And so you won't have to bump up your ISO as much when you're in darker areas and get that grainier, noisier video. You can open up your aperture, like I said, all the way down to like f2, f1.8, or even f1.4 with some lenses, and get that bright, great looking video in darker scenarios without having to just push your ISO all the way up and get really noisy, grainy videos. This is the 50mm f1.8 right here, and this really is an extremely small lens. You barely even notice it on the camera. It's really light, and the 50mm you can pick up for like less than 200 bucks. So if this is gonna be your first lens, if you just have the kit lens right now, you really cannot go wrong with the $180 or $200 50mm f1.8. Alright, now going off of the fast aperture lenses, however this will affect you no matter what lens you have, is this right here, another filter, but this isn't a mist filter, this is actually an ND filter. And so this is essentially like sunglasses for your lens. If you're outside in a really bright area, what these are going to do is basically just darken your image up like this. You can see it just darkens it when I turn it. This is a variable ND filter, which I would personally recommend. So you can adjust to a bunch of different darknesses. Otherwise, non-variable ones, you'll just have to buy a bunch of different filters that are, all these different darknesses. So I would recommend a variable ND filter personally. If you have a wide aperture lens, like an f1.8 aperture on this camera right now, if you're in a bright area like outdoors or like where I am right now with super bright lights, you won't be able to open up your aperture all the way open to f1.8 because your image is just going to be way too bright. It's going to be completely blown out. There will be no detail, it'll just look terrible. And like I said earlier, you want to keep your shutter speed at double your frame rate, and even if you lower your ISO as far as it can go sometimes, you just won't be able to get your image dark enough with a fast aperture lens. And so that is, like I said, where ND filters are going to come in. You can thread this to the front of your lens, and so you can keep your ISO as low as possible. You can have your shutter speed double your frame rate. You can have your aperture opened up all the way to f1.8 or all the way to f2 or f2.8, and then you can use the ND filter to get the correct exposure on your image from there. And like I said, if you have a variable one, you can just turn it to get that exact exposure you need, all while keeping all of your other settings dialed in to the best quality possible. That is what I would recommend using an ND filter for. These are pretty much must-haves if you record any type of video outdoors. Alright, I'm almost done. I only got 2 more to go, but this next one is definitely the most important, and that is to record in HDR PQ mode. And so that's a setting you can enable in this camera's menu. But what this HDR PQ mode does is it actually changes to a 10-bit video recording mode, which if you don't know the difference between 8-bit and 10-bit, 8-bit video is typically what this camera records in, and it's just this type of video package that the video gets recorded into. And so 8-bit is essentially a lower quality, it has lower color depth than a 10-bit video. And so when you enable HDR PQ recording on this camera, it switches it to a 10-bit mode, which is going to give you better colors, it'll give you better looking video overall. And if you do any type of color grading and color correction, it'll give you a bunch more flexibility to really push around the colors and make this look as cinematic and as good as you possibly can. And now also being in HDR mode or high dynamic range mode, this mode is going to give you a lot more detail and quality in the shadows and the highlights and the two extremes, the dark and bright areas, versus just a regular recording mode. You might get a lot crispier, worse looking highlights or a lot worse looking shadows than you would with the HDR PQ mode. Now here's the thing, I would only recommend using this video mode if you're comfortable with color grading and color correcting your videos in a video editing software. If you don't do any sort of color grading with this footage and you just use it straight out of the camera, with the HDR PQ mode, it will look a little bit more muted, a little bit less contrasty, a little bit, less saturated straight out of the camera, which is why you really want to add that in your color correcting software. Whether you use something like iMovie, Final Cut Pro, Adobe Premiere, anything like that. Pretty much any video editing software will have these tools to add a little bit more contrast, add some of that color back into your video, in your editing software to dial in the colors and dial in the video to be exactly how you want it. And so that's the biggest thing. This HDR PQ mode will really level up your video quality. It'll give you better looking video, more dynamic range. And out of all these things, this is going to be the one that'll make the biggest substantial difference straight out of the camera. Like I said, if you're willing to do a little bit of color grading, color correcting in your editing software. All right, now the last thing I'm going to recommend is building out your Canon R50 into a little bit of a video rig with something like a cage with a top handle, adding a little bit of extra weight and adding an extra point of contact to your video rig. What this is going to do is substantially help smooth out your handheld video. So if you do a lot of handheld video recording, something like this, just going out, walking around, recording handheld footage, you're going to notice there's going to be a lot of micro jitters, a lot of little shakes, just because of how small and light of a camera this is. Every little movement your hands make, it's just going to show right up in the camera, every little jitter, every little shake. However, if you add something like a cage to your camera and you add maybe a top handle like what I have here, and even like an external battery or a monitor and things like that, what those are going to do is, first of all, a top handle like this is going to add an extra point of contact. So you can, hold it from the handle, you can hold it from the grip. You have two good points of contact right here that are alone just going to help you stabilize your video and just, get a little bit more stable handheld footage. But also just adding that little bit of extra weight to your rig, it's going to soak up those jitters and those shakes a little bit. And like I said, just give you more professional, better looking handheld video. Now, of course, this is only going to really affect you if you record a handheld video like this. If your camera is always on a tripod or, recording in a studio like what I'm doing here, obviously adding more weight and adding a handle to your rig really isn't going to affect it much. And so for the most part, this is only going to help you out if you record a lot of handheld footage. And if you do, a cage and a top handle are the two first things I would recommend. And of course, after that, you can really build this out into a bigger video rig if you need to give you those extra features, add some weight, and just add a little extra smoothness to the video output of your R50. And so hopefully this video helped you out. And if it did, please consider dropping a like and subscribing to my channel, as well as checking out all the other videos I have about the Canon R50. But that's it for me. I will see you in the next video.